India is no longer waiting for the world to take it seriously. It is no longer knocking at doors, requesting inclusion. That era is over. Now, India is at the table, not as a guest, but as a stakeholder. And the world is beginning to realize ignoring India is no longer an option. Dismissing India is no longer a strategy. Pressuring India? That doesn't work either. This is a country that has learned to navigate the global stage with strategy, resilience, and increasing leverage. And in 2025, as Donald Trump returns to the White House for a second term, the United States finds itself facing a country it can no longer view as a developing junior partner. It's facing a sovereign, ambitious, and deeply self-aware India, one that is unafraid to walk away from bad deals and even more unwilling to compromise its national interest for short-term applause. A trade deal is on the horizon. Or at least the world hopes so. But this time, it's not the US calling the shots unilaterally. Because India isn't entering the negotiation room with its head down. It's entering with its head held high, backed by years of diplomatic realignment, economic reforms, rising technological prowess, and a clear vision of self-reliance and strategic autonomy. So, let's call it what it is. This is not just another trade negotiation. This is a test of global power rebalancing. This is about whether the world's largest democracy and arguably the most important emerging economy of the 21st century can sit across from the United States, look it in the eye, and say, "We want a deal, but we want it on our terms." And here's the thing, India might just get it. To understand how India has earned this leverage, you have to look back at the last decade, not just in terms of GDP numbers or infrastructure projects, but in how India has consciously shaped its image and influence in the international arena. A country of 1.4 billion people, now the most populous in the world, has spent years slowly, methodically strengthening its diplomatic hand. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has not chased global validation, it has crafted strategic autonomy. That's an important distinction. India has formed alliances with the Quad, with the United States, with Europe, with the Global South. But it has also refused to be tied down. It bought oil from Russia when the West said don't. It walked away from the China-led RCEP agreement when it felt its farmers and manufacturers would suffer. It said no to big tech when data privacy was at stake. And it created digital public infrastructure that even the most advanced economies are now studying. This is not the India of the 1990s or even the early 2000s. This is an India that negotiates not as a junior partner, but as a sovereign equal. It has leverage, and more importantly, it knows how to use it. Now, with Trump back in the Oval Office, the scene is set for what could be one of the most defining trade moments of the decade. The question is no longer whether India is willing to engage, it's whether the US is willing to deal with a confident India that won't be pressured, won't be bullied, and won't be baited into a short term when that undermines its long-term goals. Trump has always been transactional. He believes in deals that deliver results, especially for the American economy. His America First philosophy hasn't changed. If anything, it's been reinforced by political validation. He wants lower trade deficits, more manufacturing at home, stronger protections for U.S. industries, and less dependence on nations that he believes take advantage of the U.S. market. But India isn't China. And that's the crucial difference that may define how this negotiation plays out. Trump may have clashed with China, imposed tariffs, and triggered a trade war, but India is not entering that category. India is a democracy. India shares key values with the US. It is not a competitor in the ideological sense. It is a potential ally, a potential partner, and a necessary counterweight in the Indo-Pacific. In other words, if Trump wants to compete with China, he needs India. And India knows that. That's where the leverage begins. So, what exactly does the United States want from India right now? The list isn't new. Washington wants greater access to India's massive consumer market, particularly in agriculture and high-value manufacturing. It wants fewer tariffs on iconic American exports. Think Harley-Davidson motorcycles, medical devices, agricultural products like almonds and dairy. It also wants stronger intellectual property enforcement, especially in pharmaceuticals and software. American tech companies want fewer regulatory restrictions in India, more freedom to operate, and fewer obligations around data localization and compliance. But India has a list of its own. India wants fewer visa restrictions for its high-skilled tech workers, especially under the H-1B and L-1 categories. It wants access to U.S. markets for its pharmaceutical generics, textiles, and low-cost manufacturing. It wants defense technology transfers, co-production, and long-term contracts that build local capacity. And most importantly, it wants the U.S. to respect its digital sovereignty, meaning India decides how its citizens' data is stored, managed, and monetized. Not Silicon Valley. At first glance, these lists look incompatible. But here's the nuance. Both countries want strategic alignment, and that gives them room to maneuver. Let's zoom out a bit. India's strategy for the past decade has been about self-reliance, not isolation. That's a subtle but critical difference that most Western commentators still miss. Atmanirbhar Bharat isn't about closing off India to the world. It's about ensuring that when India opens up, it does so from a position of strength. On its terms, in its own interest. That's why India has been cautious in its trade deals. It walked away from the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, even after years of negotiation. Why? Because opening up its agricultural markets to China and Southeast Asia would have meant exposing millions of small farmers to subsidized, industrial-scale competition. That wasn't a compromise India was willing to make, and the world took note. India has also taken its time negotiating with the European Union and the United Kingdom. Not because it's hesitant, but because it's deliberate. Every clause, every term is being scrutinized to ensure India doesn't become a low-margin export market for Western goods at the cost of its domestic industries. This isn't stubbornness. It's strategy. And it's working. Look at what's happened since. India has become one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, even without a major free trade agreement in place. It has become a preferred destination for manufacturing as global supply chains move away from China. Apple is building iPhones in India. Semiconductor companies are being courted with subsidies and infrastructure. Defense giants are signing co-production agreements. Global investors are increasing their stakes in Indian tech and infrastructure. India is integrating with the global economy, but on its own timeline and its own terms. This is a lesson that even the United States is starting to recognize. Which brings us back to Trump. In his first term, a limited trade deal with India was nearly finalized. But it collapsed over some very specific issues: tariffs, agriculture, data, and pharmaceuticals. Now that he's back in office, the pressure to close a deal will return, but the terms haven't become easier. India is not in a weaker position. It is, if anything, in a stronger one. And this time, it's even less likely to concede on its red lines. What are those red lines? First, agriculture. India will not and should not open up its agriculture sector to unrestricted imports of subsidized American farm goods. The livelihood of hundreds of millions depends on this sector. Any liberalization will have to be extremely gradual, targeted, and mutually beneficial. Second, pharmaceuticals. The U.S. wants stronger IP protections. But India's generics industry is vital for global healthcare. It supplies low-cost medicines to much of the developing world. India cannot and will not let Western pharmaceutical giants undermine this capacity with extended patent monopolies. Third, data. India's data is its new oil. And India wants to ensure that data generated by Indians stays within India, not siphoned off, stored abroad, or used for opaque profiling by foreign firms. This principle of digital sovereignty is non-negotiable. Fourth, visa policy. If the U.S. wants Indian services and software, it must ensure smoother mobility for Indian professionals. Trump's past restrictions on H-1B visas hurt U.S. companies more than Indian ones. That mistake cannot be repeated. And here's what makes this entire dynamic fascinating. Despite all these tensions, the U.S. needs India for strategic reasons that go far beyond trade balances. The Indo-Pacific is the world's new geopolitical epicenter. China's aggression is not just economic, it's military, territorial, ideological. To counterbalance that, the U.S. needs reliable partners. Japan, Australia, South Korea, all are vital. But none have the population size, market scale, or geographic leverage of India. That's why the U.S. has deepened defense ties with India. It has signed foundational agreements. It is co-developing military platforms. It is increasingly treating India not just as a customer, but as a partner. And that relationship, if nurtured correctly, will be the foundation for everything else, including trade. India understands this, and it's playing its hand with quiet confidence. Behind the scenes, it is preparing for multiple trade scenarios. It is streamlining its customs systems. It is refining its manufacturing incentives. It is investing in digital infrastructure. It is expanding export capabilities in key sectors like electronics, biotech, and clean energy. India doesn't need to sign a massive, sweeping free trade agreement to grow. But it is willing to engage sector by sector, clause by clause, if the terms make sense. That's why analysts believe a mini deal is far more likely than a grand agreement. A mini deal that focuses on semiconductor cooperation, digital trade standards, defense co-production, pharmaceutical approvals, mobility of skilled labor. Each of these can be negotiated independently, and together, they would build momentum for a broader economic partnership. But again, only if India's core interests are respected. Because this time, India is not going to compromise just to make a deal. It has no reason to, and every reason to wait for the right one. So, where do we go from here? India has made one thing clear: its future lies in controlling its own destiny, not being molded by Western assumptions or pressured by foreign playbooks. And perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in the digital sphere. Let's talk about digital sovereignty, one of the most misunderstood and underestimated pillars of India's trade stance. India sees data not just as an economic commodity, but as a national asset, a strategic resource, something that, if left unguarded, could leave a billion citizens vulnerable to exploitation, economic, political, and even ideological. For decades, Western tech companies operated on a model of extract and export. They collected data in emerging markets like India, monetized it in Silicon Valley, and returned little in value or accountability. But India didn't let that model settle. It pushed back hard. It forced companies like WhatsApp, Amazon, and Google to store data locally. It created one of the most comprehensive public digital infrastructure stacks in the world: Aadhaar, UPI, DigiLocker, Cowen. It refused to let foreign companies become gatekeepers of Indian identity, payments, or healthcare. And here's the kicker: India built this digital ecosystem as a public good, not a corporate asset. And that has stunned the world. In the US, even basic identity systems are fragmented. In Europe, fintech is still catching up. In many emerging nations, digital governance is chaotic. But India, with all its scale and complexity, has created something few believed possible: a sovereign, secure, scalable digital system owned by the people, not by big tech. That's why digital trade is such a sensitive topic in India-US negotiations. The US wants rules that ensure free cross-border data flows, limited restrictions on foreign cloud services, and open access to India's digital markets. India says, "Not so fast. We're happy to cooperate, but our data stays here. Our digital laws are made here. And foreign companies must play by Indian rules, not expect India to bend to theirs." This isn't digital nationalism. It's digital maturity. And it's one of the clearest signs that India is no longer willing to be a sandbox for Western innovation. It wants to be, and increasingly is, an innovator in its own right. But India's evolution hasn't only been digital. It's been doctrinal. Let's talk about trade doctrine. Go back to the early 2000s. India was opening up cautiously. The world wanted faster liberalization. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, was the main arena. But something kept happening. India kept getting sidelined. Its concerns were heard, but not acted on. Its pleas for special safeguards for food security, subsidies, development flexibility were often brushed aside. Developed nations came in with large delegations, complex technical language, and aggressive strategies. India wasn't naive, but it wasn't yet assertive. That's changed. Over the last 20 years, India has invested in trade expertise, built institutions, developed negotiation muscle, and, most importantly, cultivated strategic patience. It realized that signing a bad deal is worse than signing no deal. So when WTO talks deadlocked over food security, India didn't cave. When the West pushed for stronger IP protections, India defended its right to protect generics and access to medicine. When climate trade-offs threatened domestic development, India pushed back and won allies from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. In other words, India learned how to play the long game. And now, those lessons are paying off. Today, Indian negotiators are respected not just for their technical competence, but for their conviction. India is no longer the awkward partner. It's the necessary partner, the one everyone wants on board, because without India, no deal is truly global. This credibility extends far beyond trade. Look at defense and security. India has gone from a major arms importer to a co-developer of platforms. Its partnership with the US has evolved from symbolic naval exercises to joint production of drones, fighter jet engines, and long-term logistics agreements. Why? Because India isn't just buying hardware anymore. It's buying strategic depth. The US knows this. That's why, even under Trump's America First lens, India has remained a top defense priority. Trump likes strength and India projects strength. Not arrogance. Not aggression. But quiet, consistent strength. And let's be clear, India does not want to become a junior military ally. It doesn't want permanent bases or NATO-style entanglements. What it wants, and what it's getting, is respect for its strategic autonomy. That's why India can buy Russian S-400 systems and still conduct joint patrols with the US Navy. It's why it can conduct Malabar exercises with Japan and Australia while maintaining BRICS cooperation. It's not contradiction. It's calibration. India doesn't choose sides. It chooses strategy. And in today's polarized world, that's power. But there's more. Let's talk about soft power. The influence that doesn't come from GDP or missiles, but from culture, leadership, and moral clarity. India today is not just exporting software and services. It's exporting narrative. It's telling the world a different story, that development doesn't have to copy the West. That democracy doesn't have to mean disorder. That tradition and technology can coexist. That sovereignty doesn't mean isolation. Think about how India managed COVID. It didn't just vaccinate 1 billion people. It developed its own vaccine, ran the world's largest digital vaccination drive, and shipped free doses to over 70 countries without fanfare, without conditions. Think about how India handles climate. It didn't just sign agreements. It built the world's largest renewable energy expansion program, committed to net zero by 2070, and launched the International Solar Alliance. This is the new India, pragmatic, visionary, and deeply rooted in civilizational confidence. No longer reacting to global trends, now shaping them. So when Trump's advisors walk into the trade negotiation room, they're not facing the India of 2017. They're facing an India that has grown, not just in economic terms, but in strategic consciousness. And here's what makes it all the more powerful. India is not desperate. It doesn't need this trade deal for survival. It doesn't need validation. It's growing without it. But it's open to a fair, mutually respectful agreement. One that respects India's red lines, its data, its farmers, its markets, and its vision of development. That's the offer on the table. And if Trump truly wants to leave a legacy in Asia, if he wants to counter China not just militarily but economically, he will have to engage with India on those terms. This is not a threat. It's a fact. Because the world is shifting. India is not the last piece of the puzzle. It is the puzzle. Without India, there is no Indo-Pacific strategy. Without India, there is no viable counterweight to China. Without India, the democratic world cannot claim to be truly global. And that's why this trade negotiation matters so much, not because of the tariffs, not because of the trade balance, but because it's a test. A test of whether the U.S. is willing to treat India as an equal. A test of whether two democracies, very different, but fundamentally aligned, can forge a model of cooperation that respects sovereignty without sacrificing ambition. And perhaps most importantly, a test of whether the world is ready to accept that India has arrived. Not as a copy of China, not as a balancing power, but as India. Unique, independent, indispensable.